This lesson reviews operating on fractions. Fractions are part of a whole. Here's a half of a whole, here's a third of a whole, a quarter. You'll notice that as your denominator gets greater, the pieces are actually smaller. One thing we can do with fractions is multiply them. So let's say you wanted to go 2 times a quarter. So you can take a quarter twice, and that actually gives you 2 over 1 times 1 over 4. That's 2 times 1, 2 times 2 groups of 1, and then 1 times 4, giving you 4. Now that can actually simplify by dividing the numerator and the denominator by 2. You can do the same thing to the numerator and the denominator, giving you 1/2. And you'll notice 2 quarters is the same as 1/2. So in general, you're actually multiplying the numerators and multiplying the denominators. However, you'll notice that this division here could have been completed right away. So alternatively, you could have looked at, the 2's in the numerator and the 4's in the denominator. I could simplify those first. Divide them both by 2 in your head, giving you 1 over 2. Then you go 1 times 1 is 1, 1 times 2 is 2. So that's a little bit of a simpler way to complete your multiplication. So the easiest thing is to first reduce your greatest common factor in your numerators denominators. So that's what I did right there. Next, you want to multiply your numerators, and then you want to multiply your denominators, leaving you with the answer. Let's look at dividing fractions. So an example here would be, say you had 4 divided by a half. So that's saying how many halves fit into 4. By common sense, if you had 4 things, each one would have half going into it, meaning each group has 2 in it. Therefore, you're actually taking 4 over 1, multiplying by 2 over 1. So you're always going to flip that second fraction and multiply by it, and it's always going to work out that way. So really you have 8 pieces, 8 times that a half fits into 4. And that's 8 over 1, which is also 8. So you're going to multiply the first fraction by the reciprocal or the flip of the second fraction. Then you just follow as you did with multiplying fractions. And let's review adding and subtracting fractions. So adding and subtracting fractions is a little different. You don't cancel things like this, there's none of that. You don't flip, there's none of that. However, there is something very important with adding and subtracting fractions. Let's just start by considering what would you do if you had to add a quarter and a half. Well, you can see by this picture here of this pie, or this cake, a half and a quarter is 3/4. You can kind of see that. But how do we do that with the math? Like 1 plus 1 is 2, 4 plus 2 is 6. That 2/6 is 1/3. That's not 3/4 at all. So remember, when you add and subtract fractions, the pieces have to be equal in order to add the numerators. So if you have quarters, well then the rest of it has to be in quarters. So a half actually can be converted into quarters because 2 can multiply to get 4. If you split this half into 2 pieces, meaning multiply both sides, top and bottom, by 2, you actually get a quarter plus 2 quarters. And hopefully you agree that 2 quarters is the same as a half. So now you have 2 quarters and 1 quarter, giving you 3/4. So you'll notice you have to have the same common denominator to add or subtract fractions. So you want to find the lowest common denominator by looking at what the two denominators can both multiply by in order to get something. So lowest common denominator is actually the same thing as lowest common multiple. So for example, for 4 and 2, a multiple of 4 would be 4, 8, 12, etc. And multiples of 2 would be 2, 4, 6, 8, etc. So the common multiples are 4, 8, but the lowest common multiple was 4. Now there are quicker techniques of finding lowest common multiples for bigger numbers, and you can ask me about that, or maybe I'll make a video on it if I get enough interest. Once you have the lowest common denominator, you want to convert each fraction to that common denominator as we did right here. So you can multiply the numerator and denominator in order to have the exact same denominators. Then we can follow with adding or subtracting the numerators. At the very end, if you can still simplify, do simplify if possible. You always want to answer in simplest form. So you look for any common factors between the numerator and denominator and divide that out. All right, let's look at some examples here. So this first one is a multiplication question. Remember, for multiplying fractions, we want to first look at simplifying any numerators with any denominators. But in this case, we have some signs and some brackets. Let's deal with that first. 15 can be written as 15 over 1. Always remember, a whole number can be written over 1, because if you divide by 1, it just stays the same. With signs, try to complete the sign first. So look at positive times negative is negative, times negative is positive. So the overall answer here will be positive. So now let's rewrite what we have. We have 15 over 1 times 3 over 14 times 7 over 20. So let's take a look at seeing what we can simplify here. Are there any common factors in the numerator and denominator that we can simplify? And remember, you can pause this video, try it on your own, and then come back. So here we go. We've got 7 over 14. 7 and 14 have a common factor of 7. Divide them both by 7, giving you 1 and 2. 15 and 20 have a common factor of 5. Divide them both by 5. You get 3 and 4. I think that's it. So let's go on and multiply these numbers here. So 3 times 3 gives us 9, and 2 times 4 gives us 8. You'll notice that's complete. If you didn't simplify first, you would have had 15 times 3 times 7 and 14 times 20, which are really big numbers, and then you actually need to have a calculator. Whereas this way, it's a little simpler. Next up, we've got a division problem. So let's start here. We've got 1/6, and remember, when you're dividing, you need to flip the second fraction. We can also look at the sign here. Is positive times, or positive divided by negative, is overall going to be a negative, and then we're done with the sign. Just deal with it at the beginning and leave it there. So we got 1/6 times the reciprocal, which is 12 over 5. It's still a negative. I just did that at the beginning. So let's look at if we can simplify anything. 6 and 12 both divide by 6, leaves us with 1 and 2. Therefore, we've got 1 times 2 and 1 times 5. All right, let's look at one with a variable. It's a multiplication question, so we can write this over 1. We want to look for any common factors between the numerator and denominator, and in this case, I don't think anything simplifies. So let's go on and multiply the numerators and then multiply the denominators. 1 times 5t is 5t, 2 times 1 is 2, and so remember, adding and subtracting fractions, you need to have a common denominator for plus and minus. making it a big point here. So what's the common denominator for 4, 6, and 8? So you could just think and say, what can I multiply both of those numbers, all of those numbers into? There is a method. You could go 4, 6, and 8, and you could find the prime factorizations of each one of those, and then line up any common factors. So the 4 was a 2 times a 2. The 6 was a 2 times a 3, and I'm only putting the same numbers in each column, so the 3 had to make a new column. And the 8 was a 2 times a 2 times another 2. That gives us 2 times 2 times 3 times 2. What this method does, it eliminates any common things, but then also makes rows for unique factors. So that gives us 4 times 6, which is 24. You could try to come up with that number in your head, though, if you are really good at the multiplication tables. So let's convert these all into 24. So 4 times 6 times 6 will give us 24. 6 times 4 times 4 give us 24. 8 times 3 times 3. That gives us 18 over 24 minus 28 over 24 plus 3 over 24. Now we can just combine our numerators. So 18 minus 28 plus 3 gives us negative 7. Oops, that was supposed to be a 24 there. Sorry about that. Negative 7 over 24. You can also look to see if there's anything to simplify here, but there isn't. Alright, next we've got negative 2. Remember, you can write it over 1. Common denominator for 1 and 3 is 3 because 1 can be turned into a 3 by multiplying by 3, giving us negative 6 over 3 plus 4 over 3. Combine the numerators. Negative 6 plus 4 is negative 2 over 3. No common factors, so we can leave it. Next up, 18 and 12. So this one, if you're not sure what the common denominator is, you can use this LCM or LCD method here. So let's take the prime factorization of 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 3. And 12 is 3 times 4 and 2 times 2. So 18 is written as 2 times 3 times 3. 12 is written as 2 times 2 and then times another 3. So make sure they're lined up, but if it doesn't line up, you just create a new column. So 2 times 3 times 3 times 2 gives us 4 times 9, which is 36. So 18 and 12 both multiply into 36. Times 2 times 2 times 3 times 3. So let's try that. We've got negative 14 over 36 plus 15 over 36. And 15 minus 14 is 1 over 36.